Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to be able to talk to you. I guess that most of you probably have your mind set on the tasting, which is coming later. But I do want you to listen to some of the things I have to say. So we're going to have a little quiz at the end of the lecture. 70% and above, you get to go to the tasting. No refunds for the rest of you. A little bit about me. I've lived in Japan about 18 years now. My background is in comparative philosophy, studying Japanese philosophy and Japanese aesthetics. But now I'm working in comparative culture and eco-criticism. I've been into craft beer since about 2005. And I kind of got into beer in Europe. I write for the Japan Beer Times, and I'll give you some information about that. It's a free magazine that's available online. And my book was published just about a year ago. It was about 4 years of intense research, trying about 2,000 Japanese beers and taking notes on them. I'd like to stress that I have no connection to anyone in the beer industry. I'm an independent scholar, independent researcher. My university is my main job, and so I like the freedom that gives me to be outside of the industry. Just a brief introduction to the history of beer in Japan. Of course, there's sake, and even though in English it's mostly called rice wine, it's not wine at all, it's beer. It's made from grain, just like barley-based beer. And this has been brewed for about 2,000 years in Japan. And so they really do have a beer tradition, just slightly different than the European one. The first Japanese probably tasted barley-based beer at Dejima. They probably got it from the Dutch in the 16th or 17th century. We have some records that show people tasting it and saying it tasted quite awful. But I don't know how good the Dutch beer would have been then. I've heard that they used soba and other kinds of different grains to brew it there. Kawamoto Komin is said to be the first Japanese to brew beer in around 1853. We can't really verify that, but there's a beer named after him now from someplace near Kobe. It's often said that Spring Valley Brewing was the first brewery set up in Japan by an American. He was a Norwegian American, and this was in Yokohama. We also can't really verify this, but about that time, 1870, is the first time that breweries started popping up in the Yokohama area. A lot of people like to talk about how Japan doesn't have an old brewing tradition, and certainly that's true in a sense. But one thing that I think is very interesting is that lager beer has been brewed in Japan almost as long as it's been brewed anywhere else. So the breweries that still exist now, Sapporo, Asahi, Ebisu, were all coming into being in the 1870s through the 1890s. And they were brewing bottom fermented pale lagers, which were just invented a few decades before that. So as you see here, Pilsner Urquell first came out 1842, Anheuser-Busch's Budweiser 1869. So it's only 7 years between Budweiser coming out first in America and Sapporo's first lager beer coming out in Japan. So the history of those kind of Pilsner-based beers is almost as long in Japan as it is anywhere else. Now, Japanese beer is kind of epitomized by the dry beers. And I think many of you have probably tried Asahi Super Dry. This came out in 1987. And this was made with special enzymes that will eat away almost all the remaining sugars, the maltose, taking away all the sweetness. And it will give it a very clean and dry finish, which is supposed to be very good with Japanese food. So if you're eating sashimi, the beer doesn't get in the way. It doesn't get in the way of the subtle flavors of raw vegetables or raw fish. And with this, Asahi took over the #1 spot in the country in 1987, and Kirin has been battling to try to get back in #1 on and off since then. But, well, sorry if anyone from Asahi's here, though, but it made beer very tasteless. It's a beer that doesn't get in the way of food. It doesn't have much flavor. And these became really the kind of standard in Japan after 1987. This dry beer is thought to go well with food. It doesn't get in the way. And so what you get is this toriaizu biru. You go out to an izakaya And well, you get off work, you're going off, especially if you're going with people from work, you start with a beer. You don't ask what kind of beer. Most izakaya only have one kind of beer, and you just order a beer. And then when the food comes, you think, well, if there's going to be some kind of pairing done, it's usually with sake or with wine, not with beer. Beer is refreshing. Beer is something to pick you up after work. It's not something that people really seriously think about tasting. And of course, it's been like that in America for a long time as well, before the craft beer movement got big. Some of you probably know this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but something very interesting about beer in Japan is there are different tax categories that are based upon the amount of malt, the percentage of malt that's used in the beer. And so what can be called actually biru, beer, has to have 50% of the fermentables made from barley malt. It can use no spice or fruit. And this is taxed at 220 yen a liter. So it's almost $2.20 now. And this is quite incredible tax. It's one of the world's highest taxes on beer. In America, it's something like 14 cents a liter. So it's more than 15 times higher than the United States. And it makes beer very expensive. In order to avoid that tax, these other categories of beer have come about. Happōshu. This has less than 50% malt. Actually, a lot of American industrial lagers would probably fit in this category. They use corn, starch, rice, sugars as fermentables. And these are taxed at 134 to 178 yen a liter, and depending on the percentage of malt. These started to appear in the 1990s, and they certainly took a lot of business from beer, from real beer. But recently, the shin genre, the new genre, or also called number three, third category beer, daisan, it's kind of pejorative. These are very strange creatures. I don't think you can get any of these in America. There'd be no reason to export it, but these are, there's two types. There's one type which is happōshu, which is brewed with very low amount of malt, and then it has spirits, basically shochu, pure alcohol, kicked into it to kick the alcohol up. And it's not malt liquor, it's not very strong, but there's not enough fermentables there to make a proper beer, so they add spirits. That's one type. The other type is peas or soybeans are substitutes for the malt. So actually there's no malt at all. It's made from fermented beans or peas or of some sort, and then spiced up to taste like beer. No one drinks these because they like them. You see, the tax is 80 yen a liter. People drink it because of the price. And this is a big problem, I think, for industrial brewing in Japan. So many people are buying these third category beers that real beer is not selling. The sales of the category beers are booming. For almost every brewery, their top sellers now are the third category stuff. So I'll take a little look here. Price differentials. A premium all malt lager such as Ebisu is about 214 yen a can. This is for a 12-ounce can. So, I mean, you can imagine something like a Michelob selling for, I mean, this is a liquor store price. This is not a bar price. A regular lager, not all malt, but more than 50% malt, like Asahi Super Dry, 191 yen a can. Happōshu, like this Kirin Tande, 157 yen a can. Well, the third category, 119 yen a can, so about half of a 100% malt beer. And this Nodogoshi Nama by Kirin is the #1 selling beer taste product in Japan now. I won't call it beer. And on the strength of that, Kirin had taken over the #1 spot. It keeps going back and forth between Kirin and Asahi are just about the same, but that's Kirin's best seller. It's the #1 seller in all of Japan. Oh, just to compare with that, craft beer would range from the cheapest craft beer you'll find in a can will be about 260 yen, so about 40 to 50 yen more than Ebisu, and that'll go up to about 500 yen. So craft beer is considerably more, although the canned versions are not that much more than the all malt lagers. Jibiru. Jibiru means it's I think a translation of land beer from German, but Jibiru, Jizake, Jidori, local. It just means local in Japanese, and it came up really as something that is representative of the locale. And this was only legalized really. It was only made possible in 1994. Before that, a brewery had to make over 2 million liters a year, which is something like 20,000 barrels, in order to get a brewing license, which is quite a lot. But after 1994, these numbers were dropped. So 60,000 liters for a beer license and 6,000 liters for a happoshu license, and you could get a license. Still very difficult to actually get a license, but made much easier. Right after 94, craft breweries sprung up everywhere. So there were over 400 at one time. Most of the people who were brewing didn't really know how to brew. See, home brewing was and it still is illegal in Japan. It's illegal to home brew. And so most of these people who were brewing in these craft breweries had no experience doing this. So you can guess what kind of flavors were coming out of these. For a while, most copied German styles because this is what people knew. Asahi also kind of helped people, teaching them how to brew. And basically they said, golden ale, Kelch. Dark ale, alt. That's where you are. And so there were over 100 Kelches and 100 alts in Japan. There still are more than 50 of each made there. They're very different from what you have in Cologne or Dusseldorf. But you see this a lot in Japan. A lot of Weizen. And one thing that I want to point out, this is kind of interesting, I think, that a lot of these new microbreweries were tied to touristic interests in the countryside. A lot of people saw this 94, right after the bubble burst. A lot of places in the countryside were running out of money. They were looking for things to bring tourists in. They were looking for attractions. And for some reason, they thought, wow, we just got to have beer. If we open up a brewery, people will come. Unfortunately, when the beer was 2 to 3 times the price of a Kirin or an Asahi and much lower quality, people, stopped coming quite quickly. So a lot of these breweries didn't last very long. Of the 400, probably 300 have come and gone in this time, with other new ones still coming, a lot now as well. I'll skip this. All right, Japanese craft beer today. There are 223 breweries that I know of. A few more now, I think. There's still a strong German influence, but lately American craft beer has become the prominent influence, become more pronounced. It's most popular in the Kanto area, Tokyo, Yokohama. Most bars will have some kind of craft beer. Not like that in the Kansai area where I live. And a true second boom seems to be happening now. Big boom after 94. A lot of mistakes were made. It kind of died down. And I think since about 2010, it's really been building steam again and continues to build steam. A little sociology. I think these are kind of interesting for me. There's a lot of participation by non-Japanese in this industry, and obviously I'm one of them, and this is kind of fun for me. 2 recent breweries came out that are owned by non-Japanese, as well as 3 or 4 brew pubs in the last year. 2 I know were British men who are brewers and came and started making British-style beers, and there's 2 or 3 more coming. There are home brewers, even though it's illegal. It's illegal, but it's not punished in any way. So you can actually buy home brewing sets in the supermarket, in the department store, even though it's technically illegal. It's quite funny. They sell malt extract sets, and there's enough to make a 5% beer. So there's a label on each one that says, brewing 5. You can brew a 1% beer. 1% is legal. So on the kits, there's a sticker on there that actually says, it would be illegal to make this because it'll be 5%. So either use only 1/5 of the can or use 5 times the water they tell you to use. This is true. You can go to the Don Quixote stores and you can buy this there. It's quite funny. can imagine what this would taste like if you actually did that. There's a lot of connection lately with people in American, Belgian, and Asian craft beer scenes. It's really becoming more outward looking the last 5 years or so. And people like myself, there's a lot of non-Japanese in beer journalism in importing and exporting as well. I think most of you can see Westerners. We make up less than 0.5% of people living in Japan, Western-looking people. But in any craft beer bar, probably about 10%, 5 to 10%. So there's a lot of foreign-looking people involved in this scene. But also, I think it's very interesting looking at gender, because roughly half of, I haven't done a serious survey, but roughly half of craft beer consumers are women. And I think this is quite different from what we see in the States. I think in the States it's changing, and more women are getting involved in craft beer. But in Japan, it's always been roughly half. And I have friends who come over from the States and go to festivals, and they say, I can't believe there's so many girls here. It's quite prominent. Many prominent brewers are women, and many pub owners as well. And even though they still tend to market fruit beers as women's beers, it really does miss the mark, because women in Japan a lot of women are really into beer, hoppy beer, strong beer, all different kinds of beer. And it makes for a very fun and interesting scene. Okay. I'm quite interested in stylistic influences in the kinds of beers that are being made, and I want to talk a little bit about that. From the beginning, as I mentioned before, German influence has been very strong. And one thing I think that's interesting is it still is quite strong. I get in trouble with some of my American friends because I've claimed in the past that you can get better German and Czech style beers in Japan than you can in America. And this made some of my beer geek friends quite angry. But I think you can get quite excellent Pilsners, quite excellent wheat beers made very closely to the way they're made in Europe. And that's something that's quite nice. There's a much smaller influence of Belgian beers and UK styles, but they're there. UK has been there for quite a long time. More and more people are getting interested in Belgian beers, but like it was in the US about 10 years ago, they're not really right yet. They don't really get it right down most of the time. There is an enormous boom in fruit beers. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but lots and lots of fruit beers coming out all the time, and I think more than you see almost anywhere else. And there's also some influences coming from sake brewing, and this is one of the more interesting things I see, as well as using kind of traditional Japanese ingredients. Very big American craft influence, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. There's a big rise in the use of citrusy hops, Cascade, the C hops, Cascade, Citra, Centennial, very fruity, citrusy flavors. The breweries that are doing well now, the ones that are growing and that are really selling a lot of beer, are all kind of moving in the direction of American style craft beer. Lots of IPAs. For example, the Session IPA, which really just became a big hit in the US this year, almost came simultaneously in Japan. I think a lot of people in Japan are watching, they're reading beer, they're looking at Rate Beer, Beer Advocate, seeing what's popular and copying that. So, whereas, for example, whiskey barrel aging, which has only been the last couple years in Japan, came much later than this boom in America. The Session IPA was almost at the same time. So a lot of people are really watching what's happening in the States. Some of the interesting things that are happening, I'd like to just introduce to you. The influence of sake and the use of rice. Sake rice, koji, sake yeast are being used by several different breweries to make different kinds of beer. Some age their beers in cedar, like taruzake. Many breweries use koshikari rice in their beers. I don't really think that's very interesting, but it's often used by people from Niigata, where the rice is grown as a kind of local product. A few examples are written there. We'll have one or two, I think, tonight as well. This one we won't have tonight. I wish we could have it, but this is a rice barley wine made with sake yeast and koji, which was quite excellent. It really was the closest kind of mixture between beer and a kind of nice ginjo that I've ever had. If you ever see orochi, pick it up. Also, many brewers using Japanese-style additives. This one is kinshachi from Nagoya, matcha drafto. So this is using matcha in the beer. You can see that there's a nice color there. I think in this case, and my friend is the brewer, so I hope he'll forgive me, but the color is the best thing about this beer. It's very, very astringent, and I told him I don't think it works, and he says, yeah, I hate that beer, but it's our best seller. The same brewery also makes a beer with miso, makes two beers with miso in it, which actually are quite excellent. They're dark lagers, and the miso adds this umami and this nutty flavor that works very well with the beer. Those I like. This one, no. A few beers have been made with wasabi. The first one was really strong wasabi forward type of beer made by a brewery in Iwate, which this brewery does not exist anymore. I don't know what the connection was, but it's hard to, I know there's some brewers in America have also used wasabi. I haven't tried any of the American ones. Baird, we'll have some of their beers tonight. They're using wasabi and green tea in a new pale ale, but they're both very light, and it really only gives a little bit of heat at the finish. We won't have that tonight, unfortunately, but it's kind of interesting. One brewery in Shikoku made a beer with katsuobushi, bonito flakes in it, and this is another brewery that doesn't exist anymore. I never had a chance to try that. I think it might have been interesting. I think they were trying to get a German smoked beer, a Rauch beer flavor out of it, which could work, I think, but unfortunately I never had a chance. Many breweries are using sansho, which is kind of Szechuan pepper that often in Japan it's eaten with eel or with udon, and it works in some, it doesn't work in others. It's kind of interesting. Also shiso, perilla leaf, another one that it has to be handled right. I've had some that were excellent and some that were horrible, and I think this is a really interesting thing that's happening now. A lot of brewers want to make something that will be to Japan what the IPA was to America, right? The IPA became the American beer, right? They used to brew it in England, but the new IPA is really American, and this was the cornerstone of American craft beer, and everyone in Japan, not everyone, but a lot of brewers want to be the person who made that beer that really represents Japan to the world, and these are some attempts at that. And none has really succeeded well enough to be that beer yet. I think a lot of people are trying. And I think the sake connection is more fruitful. I think this is much more interesting. There's the first list of the examples I give here, Iwatekura Sakamai Nigori, which I'm sure none of you will ever have because it was probably just one batch. This was a dark, cloudy, like a Nigori sake beer made with 50% sake rice, and it was fabulous. A lot of people were turned off by it, but I thought it was really interesting, kind of bringing sake flavors and beer flavors together. I think this has more possibility, for kind of making something truly Japanese than these strange spices and herbs. But some of these are quite nice, and they're always fun to try. A lot of fruit beers, as I mentioned before. There's a lot of different citrus fruits grown in Japan, many of which are not really edible as fruit, but are used like we use lemon or lime to flavor foods. And almost all of these have been used in beers recently. So mikan, yuzu, kabosu, daidai, kinkan, hebetsu, dekopon, and many more. So these all just add different kind of citrus flavors, often paired with these American citrusy hops, and often work quite well together. Also, ume, plum, yamamomo, I don't know what this is called in English or in Latin, but it's a kind of wild berry. other kinds of berries, biwa, peaches, apricots, kabocha, Japanese pumpkin, following the American, which you see everywhere in Whole Foods now, the pumpkin beers. Several breweries using kabocha in their beers, as well as tropical fruits. Another very interesting thing that's happening is wild yeast beer. These are not the kind of sour beers that you think of with wild yeast in Belgium or in the US now. But they tend to be coming from trees like the cherry tree or beech trees or persimmon, often iconic trees, and they collect the yeast from the trees, and it kind of brings a bit of that flavor into the beer. This is a beer, this is a Sakura Kobo wheat. This is basically a Weizen that's brewed with yeast that came from a cherry tree. And it's very interesting because you do taste cherry. It's quite interesting and quite a good beer. And I think there's a lot of this happening, and a lot of this is quite interesting. Very different from the really sour wild beers that you get in the States sometimes. Subtle. And this is another area that I think could move forward and could be quite interesting in the future. Okay. And just a few of my thoughts about what might happen in the near future. Several of the more successful breweries are expanding. Almost every brewery now is brewing at capacity, if they want to be. I mean, there's a lot of breweries that are connected to sake makers who don't put much emphasis on their beer, and they might have empty tanks, but everyone who's really trying to make beer seems to be at capacity lately, which is good. It's also bad because a lot of bad beers are selling, just because bars can't fill their taps with really high quality things. But the better ones, these breweries are all expanding. So tonight we'll have Baird, Hitachi no Ness, Swan Lake. They've all had major renovations in the last few years. Hitachi no Ness is making a brewery, it just opened a brewery in Korea as well. They opened a brewery in Korea. Baird made a huge new brewery, just opened in June. And some of the smaller expansions as well. Some of the things that are happening, there's push for more exports to the West, but also a bigger push and even a rush to expand into the growing Asian markets. Craft beer is becoming popular in China, Singapore, Hong Kong, and little by little also in Southeast Asia and Korea. And a lot of Japanese craft brewers who have more experience than the people in those countries are looking to sell their beer there. And as I said, Hitachi no Ness already made a brewery in Korea. So it's very interesting to see how that will work. There's a slowly growing demand to get craft beer in normal Japanese bars and restaurants. I wish this was going faster, but it's slowly moving forward. One thing that's very different between the scene there and the one in the US is there's a huge festival network, beer festival network in Japan. And these are not festivals where you pay a minimal amount of money and go and drink all you want. These are really for-profit kind of festivals where it often costs more than drinking at a pub. And these are ways that breweries are making money. Profits, the festivals everywhere. I mean, one thing that is very kind of strange is the Oktoberfest. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but the Oktoberfest is very, very popular in Japan now. It tends to start in April and ends in December. Travels around the country, and several big importing companies have been behind this, and it's all for money, and it tends to be very expensive. But yeah, usually around Golden Week in the end of April, you'll see the first Oktoberfests going around. And they come for a week and then they move somewhere else. And it's usually $15 a pint for a German, Polana or German beers. But a lot of Japanese craft brewers are in on this too, and they're selling better beer because it's fresher and for a better price. So this becomes a really big part of their business plan. Fujizakura, who is one of the best brewers, I think, of German-style beers anywhere outside of Germany. A lot of their production goes right to the Oktoberfest, so much so that I can't get the beers I want a lot of the time. A lot more breweries are canning. This is a good thing in a sense, I think, because a lot of these are now getting into convenience stores and into supermarkets at a better price, and it's having more exposure to normal people. There's a growth in Tide pubs. Baird, for example, has 4 tap rooms. throughout the Kanto area. Mino Beer in Osaka has 3 tap rooms in Osaka. So there's a growth in this, supplying your own beer to your own pubs. And there's a new boom, I think, happening in brew pubs. There haven't really been many successful brew pubs in the past. Most of the time, the capacity was so small, it was hard to really get good equipment, it was hard to really get on track. But lately, there are more and more experienced brewers opening up brew pubs, really trying to serve the local market. Campion Ales in Asakusa in Tokyo is run by a British guy who makes great beer, serves it right from the tank like real ale. It's very nice. The AJB, the Anglo-Japanese brewery, is in Nagano. Thrash Zone in Yokohama, a good friend of mine who makes, for a while he made only IPAs. He decided he would only make super, super hoppy IPAs, but now he has a stout. It's a very interesting bar. It's a punk rock, thrash metal, and craft beer pub with the cheapest prices anywhere. So I think this is interesting, the growth in brew pubs. We have on the one hand a growth in, the bigger breweries getting bigger and moving more in the industrial direction, like you see here too, but the demand is growing and you see big brewers getting bigger, but you also see a more local thing happening with these brew pubs. And that's been missing, I think, in Japanese craft beer, kind of serving the local market. It hasn't really happened much yet, and I'd like to see that it's happening more. We also have crafty beer. This is a controversial topic among people who like craft beer. It's starting to be an issue in Japan. Blue Moon just started exporting to Japan this year, and it's being marketed as Japanese craft beer, American craft beer. Most people don't know that it's made by Miller Coors, and they want to keep it that way, I think. And Japanese brewers are starting to look in that direction as well. You see more and more specialty beers coming out the last few years, all malt beers, hoppier beers, unpasteurized beers. Kirin just announced they're going to open 2 new brew pubs. The Spring Valley Brewing, they took over Spring Valley Brewing in the 1890s, and they kept the name. So they're going to open 2 new brew pubs in Tokyo and Yokohama this year. So they're trying to get into the craft beer thing as well. Their normal beers aren't really selling. Nodogoshiyama, I think, the Nodogoshinama that I showed you before, I think they're a little bit embarrassed about that, and they want to kind of be known as good brewers. So this will be interesting to see what happens with that. I think this is also an interesting issue that we might see happening more in the future. The mariage, in Japanese they use the French word mariage for pairing, and this is starting to be more interesting, and more people are getting involved in this. But it still tends to be pairing beer with Western foods, with chocolate, with cakes, with Belgian-style food, French food. A lot of places are thinking about this, but very few, I think, are really looking at how to pair beer with Japanese food. And I think this is a really interesting area that people can get into and are starting to get into more. I think there's a great need for it. I think it's a fabulous idea. Brewers need to start working more with chefs, and they also need to think more in the brew pubs of serving Japanese food. I think I'm really interested in this myself. No more of this toriaizu biru, but instead, what goes with this, what goes with that. It's a very big market about to happen, I think. Problem is that the major brewers tend to have very close ties to izakaya and restaurants. Generally speaking, one of the major brewers will come in and say, okay, we give you the fridge, we give you the taps, we give you everything you need, you only serve our beer. And that tends to be the way it is, so it's very hard for craft brewers to get into a lot of these places. Some of the doubts I have, some of the questions I have. Prices are already very high, and they're going up with Abenomics. We have more inflation, we have higher taxes, and the beers have gone up about $1 a pint in the last 6 months. They're already basically normally $10 to $12 a pint at a bar. most Japanese people don't want to pay that much. And so a big question for me is not only when can I get cheaper beer, but when will the prices come down so that more normal people will be able to afford this and want to pay for this. I also wonder about this reliance on festivals. This Oktoberfest thing to me is just kind of silly. It's fun, but how long will this keep going on? When will people tire of this? And the last one, an issue everywhere, will growth make brewers forget about their loyal local customers? I really like to see a lot of these breweries being more rooted in the local community and trying to sell their beer to people who live in their own towns. So my hopes that we get more brew pubs and small breweries serving local populations, that there's less focus on what we call omiyage beer, souvenirs. A lot of these breweries around the countryside make a beer. I live in Kyoto, so you can get 3 different breweries making a beer with a nice label of Kyoto on it, selling it in Kyoto Station to people who probably won't drink it, but will give it to someone they know who likes beer. And there's no feedback, right? Someone's going to get it secondhand, try it. Oh, not so good. You paid $5 for this, but never gets back to the brewer. And I think this omiyage beer is a kind of problem, and hopefully this will kind of go away. I like to see it become less of a niche market, have widening availability and more people having access to it. There might be a room for more contract brewing, something that's very popular in the States right now. Some people don't like it, but there's a lot of big breweries that are connected, like I said before, to sake factories who are sitting idle. Maybe someone could be using that. And I like what we do see now is a focus on more interesting styles. You get more Belgian, more American craft, and more Japanese kind of original styles. So these are some of the new directions that I'm seeing that I hope keep going. That's all, and I'll take some of your questions. Well, I would just want to introduce the breweries shortly, but if you need more information, one on the left is the book I've written. We have a few copies here tonight. If you're interested, we'll have them out in the reception area. They're $20, and we can only take cash. Sorry, but if you want to get it later, or if you want the Kindle, you can find it on Amazon. On the right is the Japan Beer Times, which I also write for. You can look for the website, and you can read all the articles right online if you're interested. This is a really interesting photo. This was in Kyoto at my friend Robert Yellen's house. He's a pottery dealer. He's an expert of Japanese pottery, and they were using some handmade mugs to drink the beer there. I really like that photo. I was there that day, but I'm not in the photo. Okay. So I just want to introduce the breweries very quickly. Tachino Nest from Ibaraki Prefecture, north of Tokyo. Since 1996, they're quite well known in America. For a long time, it was easier to get their beers in New York than it was to get them in Osaka. And I complained to them about it. I don't think they cared, but they're starting to get more available in Japan, thankfully, as well. Baird Brewing. Brian Baird, I think, spoke here 2 years ago. American owner, American head brewer, making very American-style beers, but also very Japanese, using a lot of Japanese fruits and spices, doing very interesting things. Oze no Yukidoke. I didn't know that they were being exported until I saw them on the list here. Their IPA, I think we're going to have tonight. If it's in good condition, it's a wonderful kind of session IPA that was made before session IPA became popular, 5%. Very hoppy. I don't know how it survived the trip over here. They make wheat beers also, which are their mainstays. Echigo Beer was the first craft brewery in Japan. They're in Niigata. They also were a sake brewery, but they got big into beer. They're very big into canned beer, and so you can find their beers a lot around the country in cans. Ginga Kogen, making wheat beers primarily. They became very big very fast and then almost collapsed. in the 90s, they had already 3 breweries around the country. They were challenging Sapporo or Suntory for the number 4 spot, but it was too much too fast and they shrunk back down. But they're still quite visible. Their cans are available around the country, the bottles as well. Yoho Brewing. This is Yoho. It's written Yoho in English, but in Japanese it's Yoho. I don't know why. Also very visible. Their canned beers are very visible in Japan. Some of the best value you can find in Japan, often in convenience stores. Their Yone Ale, the second beer from the left, was a big hit. Kind of the first very hoppy, cascade hopped American style pale ale that was all around Japan. They have a lot. Other beers are available on hand pump, real ale versions as well. Swan Lake, one beer from them today, the barley one, which I recommend. It's about 10%. A smaller brewery, but very, very high quality in Niigata. They're connected to a wedding hall, actually. You can go and get married and have all you can drink of Swan Lake beer at your reception. Beautiful old 100-year-old beautiful Japanese-style mansion. It's a lovely place. We just went there a couple months ago for the first time. One of my favorite breweries in Japan. And Orion, it's in Japanese Orion. This is a major industrial brewery, always kind of known as the Okinawan beer, although now they're owned by Asahi, actually, and brewed throughout the country, but still has that Okinawan image. I really like this Ichiban Zakura. They make this in the spring. We won't have this tonight, but it's a dry hopped, nice lager. They make a lot of third category stuff as well, but some of the beers are quite nice. Okay, that's all for my lecture. If you have questions, we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Who are some of the American craft brewers who maybe have an outsized image there, perhaps as role models in terms of the styles they're doing?
Garrett Oliver, for one, who gave this lecture last year, is well known in Japan, and he comes to Japan every year or two and meets with other brewers and beer fans. So he's quite well known and respected. Actually, Brooklyn Lager is made in Japan as well. It's quite different from the one here, but they make a version at Itachi no Nest. A lot of West Coast, a lot of the more famous West Coast beers are being imported now. So Stone has a good image, although they're not very on a personal level. Ballast Point is very popular, and the brewers from Ballast Point have come to Japan a lot, and they've done collaborations with Japanese brewers, both here and in Japan. So they're quite well known and quite well liked. Rogue has been available in Japan for a long time. A friend of mine, American man who lives in Sapporo, Fred Kaufman, has been importing Rogue for over 20 years, so they're quite well known. I don't know how many brewers are actually known, but several of the beers are well known. But definitely Garrett Oliver has a big presence. He comes over once in a while, does food pairings and things. Yes, sir, in the back.
Answer part of my question there. Talk a little bit more about both the availability of foreign beers in Japan more generally, and also can you find a good American IPA when you go out, or is that really hard to come by? And then the availability of Japanese beers in the U.S., even in New York, here they seem incredibly scarce. And what do you expect?
I think American beers are quite available now if you know where to go. You have to know where to go. You won't find them in normal pubs, normal izakaya at all. But if you just, for example, go to Rate Beer and look at the places section in Japan and find out the pubs, you can get very good American style beers for about the same price as Japanese craft beer. Quite accessible. There's at least 4 importing companies that have started in the last 5 or 6 years, just bringing American craft beer to Japan. So it's quite well known, and it's quite easy to get. Certainly more West Coast than East Coast because it's just closer. But I've seen stuff from Ballast Point or Green Flash that even people in New York don't get, that we have on tap in Tokyo especially. So it's quite available. Belgian beer is quite available. a lot of people in America are very envious of the availability of lambics, for example. You can get Cantillon in many liquor stores around Kyoto, for example. It's just on the shelf, which, in America, this would all be bought up instantly. So Belgian beer is quite available. Now we're getting more Italian beers, Dutch, Danish, Dutch, a lot of the craft breweries that are popular now, Mikkeller and De Molen and Nugna, quite available in Japan as well. Brewdog. So yeah, it's quite good there. It's really booming, the imports as well. Exports, I think there's two issues really with exporting Japanese craft. One is that there's not enough to fill the demand in Japan. So a lot of brewers aren't really thinking about exporting because they don't have any extra beer. That's one. And I think another issue is most of these breweries are much smaller than the craft breweries in America. Much, much smaller, like a scale of 10. And most of them they don't really have very good bottling or canning equipment. So I think one of the issues is their bottles and cans are not going to really hold up that well. And they need to invest a lot of money into that kind of equipment before their beer is ready to be shipped in that form. I think that's going to hold it back for a while as well. But I'm looking forward tonight to see how these beers are, because I never had Japanese beer in the States. So I'm looking forward to see the condition that they're in. But thank you, it's a very interesting question. Yes, down the row there.
Thank you for your lecture. I have two questions, if you don't mind. First one concerns additives in beer. And I've read that the major brewers, both in the United States and in Japan, like in the US, you have your Miller, you have your Budweiser. I don't really consider it beer, but in Japan, you have your, Asahi, Sapporo, the major players. They're putting a lot of corn syrup or preservatives or other things that, especially with a lot of people moving toward whole foods and organic movements growing in Japan now as well, people want to shy away from that. So first question is, do you see a trend in craft brewing in Japan, like there have been some organic breweries here in the States that have gone for more of a natural kind of approach, something that's you feel better about drinking maybe? And the second question concerns exports as well, but the question is, what do you see as being required for Japanese beers to be successful in the U.S.? I mean, there are places you can get them, if in Japan, if you're looking for American beer, if you know where to go, you can get it. In the States, if you know where to go, there are a few places you can get some good Japanese craft beers. So do you see more of a approach that looks to fit in with the craft beer tradition of the U.S., or to tap into some of those possibly uniquely or stereotypically Japanese flavors, like the herbs and spices that you mentioned in Japanese fruits? Thank you.
The first question, there are a few breweries that make organic beers. Two come to mind right now. I think this is not really a growing field right at the moment, and the main reason is that almost all the ingredients are sourced from abroad. All the barley and the hops that are grown in Japan are pretty much used by the major breweries, and so almost all of the ingredients used in craft beer are imported, and I think that makes it much more difficult and costly to go organic. I know a few breweries that are doing that, but it's pretty difficult, and I haven't heard many people acting like they really care. So, definitely organic food is growing in Japan, and I think within a few years people will start asking for organic beer, but I don't hear that yet. And it will be hard to do, I think. The second question, I think a lot of exports are aimed at Japanese restaurants abroad. I think a lot of the sales are in Japanese restaurants. I'm eating sushi, so I want a Japanese beer to go with it. I don't think a lot of these interesting beers with Japanese style ingredients or with sake influences are being exported yet. I think, it would be interesting if they did export these. But I wonder about this. I think really for this to work and to grow, one of the major issues is price, right? I think you can see I was in a bar in San Diego and they had Hitachi no Nestan draft, and it was much more than any of the local beers, much more, and $10 or $12. So I think this is an issue. The costs are high in Japan, and when these beers are exported, they tend to cost a lot more than similar quality local beverages. And it's unless you're at a Japanese restaurant or I think a lot of it's novelty now. So it's a question: how can they? I don't really know. Maybe hitting that special Japanese style flavor will work. That would be interesting. But I don't see the brewers trying to do that yet. Touching on this maybe a little bit, the dai and the plum that these are starting to come over here more. So it'll be interesting to see that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're going to wrap up now. I'm sorry if anyone else has a question. I'll be with you next door, so we can discuss that as well. Thank you all again for coming.